This video will be, again, as always, free for you and about a very important topic. It's still about NEBOSH IGC or International General Certificate, but it's mainly about GC2, the application of health and safety at work. So paper GC2, as you will know when you start your training, is mainly about hazards or hazard analysis and controls or the precautions that you use in your risk assessment. When you're assessing risk and then you decide, after you evaluate the risk and then you decide on what are the control measures, this video is about auditing your control plan. This is very important. And by the way, it's not only for NEBOSH. As a safety advisor, as a safety inspector or officer, or whatever you call it, or even as a project manager, you need to understand how to evaluate your control plan to make sure that you covered all aspects and that you minimized the total risk to as low as reasonably practicable. Okay, so anyway, let's make it short as possible, as we usually do, and let's cut this and make it fast. First of all, I'd like to define risk. Just a quick reminder. So in the context of occupational health and safety, risk is defined as a measure of the probability for an incident to happen and of the potential severity of the consequences. And reference to this is the OHS 18001-2007. So as you can see, risk is mainly about a combination of probability of an incident to happen and the severity of the consequence. And of course, the 5 or sometimes the 6 simple steps to risk assessment, I'd like to break down step number 4 into 2. So first of all, you look for the hazard, you decide who might be harmed and how. You evaluate the risk. Is it a high risk, medium risk, low risk, acceptable, unacceptable? And then you decide on the control measures and whether if the control measures you have now are adequate or you need more. Also, you record your findings and then you review your risk assessment. So let's move on to the controls. This is the thing that this is about. So again, as I said, in GC2, it's mainly, the question will be more than 60% of the questions will be merely about hazards and control. They'll either ask you, give you a task, a piece of equipment, and ask you about the hazards, or they will ask you what are the controls, or sometimes they call it precautions. So again, whether in NEBOSH GC2 or whether in or at work, you need to understand and know how to evaluate and audit your control plan to make sure that it covered all aspects. So first thing is that we have something called the hierarchy of control. We usually start with elimination. I'm sure that many of you by now know this already. You try to eliminate the hazard. This is the best way to deal with hazards and risks. Elimination, completely removing the hazards. Or substitution, if you'd like to substitute it or replace it with a less hazardous option. And then you have engineering controls, and this might include design, isolation, lockout, tag out, anything. And administrative controls, you know, the software, like things like job rotation, instructions, supervision, training, safe systems of work, having a health safety management system, emergency response, etc. And then finally, and the last resort is personal protective equipment for all the limitations that they have, although they're still very important, and of course, disciplinary actions. Okay. Now let's see, how do you audit after deciding on your control measures? How do you audit that control plan? How do you evaluate it? What are the criteria that should be included in a successful control plan? Again, this is at work or for NEBOSH GC2, both. So after writing your control plan, make sure that you use this checklist. So what I want you to do now, get a piece of paper and write down this checklist. Write it down on a piece of paper and always keep it with you until you have it in your mind. First of all, the precautions category that you took. So you make sure that you covered both generic controls and specific controls. Generic controls are general controls, controls that fit to any task or any activity or equipment at work. Specific are those tailored controls. We're going to see a slide shortly about that. Also, you must make sure that you covered both prevention and mitigation. Why do you need to cover prevention and mitigation? We'll talk about that also shortly. And then finally, you need to check if you have covered the hierarchy of control. Did you follow the hierarchy of control, starting with elimination if possible, substitution, the last thing is PPE? I mean, it doesn't look good if you start your control measures with PPE. It should be kept as a last resort, but still considered. And then, of course, if you're dealing with machinery, you need to make sure, have you covered mechanical hazards and non-mechanical hazards, and of course, controls for both. So let's check. What do I mean by generic controls? This was covered in a previous video. Things like relevant training, clear work instructions, close supervision, sufficient risk assessment, personal protective equipment, disciplinary actions, etc., etc. So you must cover a lot of those generic controls and make sure that you tailor them a little bit to the task that you have in hand. And then make sure that you covered as well the specific controls. So what do I mean by specific controls? Specific controls are those controls relevant or tailored to the specific task or piece of equipment that you have. For example, if you're talking about chemicals, then maybe you should include some specifics like local exhaust ventilation systems, LEVs, SDS, safety data sheets, monitoring exposure times, industrial hygiene. If it's biological, then personal hygiene, vaccinations, PPE, electrical, GFCIs, RCD, fuses, etc., etc. Okay. Now, you must cover both. So check after you're done with your control plan. Check. Have you covered generic? Have you covered specific? And then next, check. Have you covered prevention controls? What are prevention controls? Those are proactive control measures which help prevent accidents before happening. And you need to understand that this covers one aspect of the risk, because risk, as defined before, what is risk? It's the probability and the severity. So we need to hit both. So for you to hit the probability and minimize it, you need appropriate prevention control measures. What are the examples for that? Examples would be, for example, for fire, prevention fire, electrical appliances maintenance, no smoking policy, good housekeeping, etc. And then you need mitigation controls. What are mitigation controls? Those are reactive measures, control measures which help in reducing the severity and the consequences of an accident after it occurs. Again, to minimize the other aspect of risk, which is the severity. So you use prevention controls to minimize probability. You use mitigation to minimize the severity. If you use only one of them, so for example, for fire, if you only say the control for fire is fire extinguishers, sprinklers, blankets, sands, etc., your control plan is a bit limping. It's not balanced. So you must balance both. Okay. And then, of course, we said you must check. Have you followed the hierarchy of control when you were setting up your control plan or when you are designing your control plan? So make sure that you always start with prevention and you go down until you reach your last resort, whether it's PPE or disciplinary actions. Okay. Now for machinery, and this is only for machinery or pieces of equipment, you must make sure that in the hazard analysis you've covered both mechanical and non-mechanical. So mechanical examples like entanglement, impact, crushing, injuries, ejection, amputations, drawing in, shearing, etc. And you must make sure that you cover the controls for that, for any piece of equipment. So NEBOSH wants to make sure that you have a bigger picture as a safety advisor. You know that each piece of machinery or equipment has two sides of hazards, mechanical and non-mechanical. Non-mechanical, like fire, electricity, noise, vibration, dust, and always ergonomics and musculoskeletal disorders, always there. So make sure if the question is about hazards or controls of, especially controls of machinery or equipment, you covered mechanical and non-mechanical, plus of course our original audit plan. Okay, so in the end you must check, have you covered prevention, have you covered mitigation? This is your audit, your checklist for your control plan. If they ask you for precautions or controls, have you covered prevention, mitigation, generic controls or general controls, and specific controls or tailored controls? Have you followed the hierarchy of controls? And in case it's a piece of equipment or machinery, have you covered mechanical and non-mechanical? Hopefully this would give you a good mark. But of course, as always, as usual, I will always remind you, always follow the command words or the action verbs, otherwise you'll not get the mark. Follow the marks assigned to each question. Check if the question specifies prevention only. This is very important because sometimes the question says, for example, identify precautions to minimize the chances of fire starting at work. If you read this properly, this question is mainly about prevention measures. So if you mention fire extinguishers, which is a mitigation, you're deviating from the relevant answer. And finally, please always audit your controls or precautions according to our control plan audit checklist, or as I call it, the CPAC. Okay, hope that helped. Thank you very much and have a good day.